That's because when they took that picture, the film was so insensitive to light that they had to hold still for 2 or 3 minutes. That was a real unsensitive film to light. Now, in some cases, in those situations, the photographer would actually strap the subjects to the chair to make sure they held still. Kind of like a trip to the dentist, so now you know why nobody ever smiled in those pictures. Now, fast forward over the decades, and we've gotten to the point where film or our sensors, because the engineers, again, when they set up these digital cameras, had to come up with some standard, set up these ISO ratings. Now, for most situations, and your camera default is set at either 1 or 200 ISO, and that'll get you a good picture, nicely exposed in most situations. But let's say you're taking a trip to the Carlsbad Caverns and you're now allowed to take pictures down there in the caverns, but you are under no circumstances allowed to take a flash picture. So this is when you want to start changing your ISO and make it more sensitive to light. So the higher the number, the more sensitive to light your camera is going to be. So as you can see from my sample here, in a dark room, here's 100 ISO, and as we start going up the scale to 1600, we're starting to get some detail in this room. Same thing would happen inside the Carlsbad Caverns. We could probably pull out a nice picture by bumping up the ISO. Now I know that some of you are saying, why should I go in here and change this back if I can set this at 8 or 1600 and know that I'm going to get a pretty good picture or well exposed picture in all situations? Because just like in film, when we first got 400 ISO or ASA film, I was really excited. It was back in the 70s. It was a big deal because now we could go inside and take pictures under regular lights without a flash. But the price of that was referred to as grainy film or grainy pictures. And it's sort of the same thing with digital photography, only it's referred to as noise on cameras, and everybody's camera is a little bit different. But as you start making making the camera more sensitive to light or moving the ISO up, what happens is those pixels start clumping together and they start losing some of their sharpness and vibrance, and they get kind of noisy. Now, if the difference is, not getting a picture in the Carlsbad Caverns or getting kind of a noisy picture, I would definitely pick a noisy picture every time. But for a nice product photo or portrait that I'm doing, that I know that I can put my camera on a tripod and set up some lights and set up the scene, I definitely want to keep my ISO down to a low level where I get the very best quality picture I can. But that is one setting that comes in handy a lot, especially if you enjoy night photography like I do. Now, I know that some of your cameras, some of you, depending on what camera you have, may not have had that sand and snow function, especially the digital SLR cameras. The digital SLR cameras don't expect you to use a sand and snow mode. They want you to kind of take control of your exposure. And there is a little button on your camera, you may have noticed, that has a plus and a minus on it. And that stands for exposure compensation. So this is where you would push this button and your LCD monitor would show you a setting. And you could change the f-stop or the exposure. You can tell your camera, I want it to be a third overexposed, a half overexposed, or I want it to be underexposed. Because when we're shooting in all white, I was talking about the sand and snow, how it turned it to gray. It does the same thing with all black. So if we're shooting at night, your camera's going to naturally want to turn all that dark blackness into gray as well. So I may need to tell my camera I want to underexpose the scene. And that is what this exposure compensation dial does. It turns on a shortcut where you can move through either your control keys or a rocker switch near your shutter release and move the exposure up or down. Now you'll have to play with this. This is not something that is good out of the box. This is something that takes a little practice in getting to know your camera, where the sweet spot is. So if you're a product photographer and you're taking pictures using the same background over and over again, you want to play with these exposures and see which one is the right one for that all white background or that all black background, and take notes. Write down what you did. When you nail it the way you like it, you don't have to always come here and start messing around and just guessing what this exposure is. You've already got it written down so that you can just come here, set it, and shoot. And that's what exposure compensation does.